The rain fell heavily on the streets of the small town of Brookfield, a place where time seemed to stand still, where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were kept with the same zeal as ancient traditions. For police officer Michael "Mike" Turner, it was just another quiet night on his patrol, not expecting any major events beyond the usual disturbance of the peace calls or minor accidents. Mike, a man in his mid-50s with features marked by time and years of service, had seen it all at Brookfield. Mike drove his patrol car through the deserted streets, his mind lost in distant thoughts, when he spotted an old car, almost falling apart, parked haphazardly in front of a closed convenience store. The car looked out of place, a relic of the 80s, with faded paint and headlights that flashed erratically as if begging for mercy. Something about the scene made him stop. As he approached, he noticed that the engine was still running, the gentle rumble only noticeable in the downpour. A strange feeling came over him, a mixture of déjà vu and apprehension, as if fate were bending in on itself at that moment. He remembered a time long ago, another rainy night, when he was still a teenager full of dreams and hopes. Before the weight of life hardened him, shining his flashlight inside the car, Mike saw a figure behind the wheel. A woman bent and shrunken, almost invisible in the dim light. His hair, wet and disheveled, partially covered his face, but something about that profile seemed disturbingly familiar. With his heart racing, he knocked on the car window, a firm but not intimidating touch. The woman slowly raised her face, revealing features that time had not been able to completely erase. Mike felt a chill run down his spine when he recognized her. It was Claire Donovan, the girl he had grown up with, his childhood best friend, and the first person he had ever fallen in love with. She had disappeared from the city more than 20 years ago, leaving no trace. Many believed that she had fled to escape a life without prospects, but no one knew for sure. Claire looked like a shadow of her former self. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were dull, as if time had sucked all the joy out of them. She tried to smile, but the gesture was more a grimace of pain than an expression of happiness.
"Mike, is that you?"
Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken for a long time. Mike, still in shock, just nodded. "Claire, what happened to you? Where have you been all this time?" Questions came up one after another, but Claire just shook her head as if the words were hard to find. She looked at him with a mixed expression of relief and fear, and then, as if a sudden decision had come over her, she whispered, "I need your help, Mike. There's a lot you don't know, a lot you've never known." They said. The officer realized that something much bigger was lurking beneath the surface of this unexpected reunion, something he might not have been prepared to discover. However, he knew he couldn't ignore her request, not after so long and so many unanswered questions. As the rain continued to pound the roof of the car and the wind whistled around the corners, Mike felt that tonight would be the beginning of a journey for truth, a journey that could change everything he thought he knew about the past and about himself. Mike felt the weight of the night intensify as he drove away from the old convenience store, Claire at his side in the patrol car. The incessant rain seemed to echo the whirlwind of thoughts that took over his mind. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unasked questions, unspoken memories. Mike knew he needed to let her speak in her own time, but the urgency in her voice, the fear in her eyes, made him want to speed up the process. As he drove through the empty streets of Brookfield, he finally broke the silence. "Claire, I need to understand. You've been missing for so long. Where have you been? What happened?" She sighed, her hand shaking, trying to fix the wet hair that stuck to her face. "Mike, it's hard to explain. After I left here, I tried to start over in another city, far away from here, but nothing went as I planned. I got involved with people I shouldn't have. Dangerous people." She paused for a moment, as if the words were difficult to pronounce. "I thought I could escape them, that I could leave everything behind. But they found me. They always find me." "Who, Claire? Who's chasing you?" Mike gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the tension build in his shoulders. The idea of Claire, the cheerful and fearless girl he had known, getting involved with criminals, was almost impossible to accept. "I can't tell you everything right now, not here, but believe me, I'm in danger, and so are you if you keep helping me." Claire looked at him with an expression of despair. "Mike, they go after anyone who comes near me. I didn't want to get you involved, but I have nowhere else to run." Mike stopped the car in front of his house, a small colonial-style property, its porch shrouded in darkness. He knew he needed to get her off the streets. He needed a safe place where they could talk without interruptions. "Let's go inside. No one will find you here." Inside the house, the sound of rain was muffled, but the tension in the air continued to grow. Mike guided Claire to the living room, where she sat on the couch, shivering with cold and fear. He brought a blanket and a cup of hot tea, trying to calm the atmosphere. "You're safe here. You can trust me." Claire looked into his eyes, and for the first time since meeting her, he saw a glimmer of hope. "I've always trusted you, Mike. Always." As the night progressed, Claire began to reveal pieces of her story, although still reluctant to share it all. She talked about how she had fled to New York after leaving Brookfield, full of dreams of a new life. There, she ended up getting involved with a charming and influential man who promised to help her achieve her goals. But what began as a fairy tale romance quickly turned into a nightmare when Claire discovered he was the leader of a drug trafficking ring. Desperate to get out of this life, she tried to escape, but was captured by the man's henchmen. For years, she was forced to work for them, using her looks and charisma to attract new members and expand the business. She never had the courage to tell anyone, for fear of reprisals. Each attempt to escape resulted in more punishment, more control over his life. Finally, she managed to escape, but she knew she was always being hunted. "Why go back to Brookfield?" Mike asked, still in disbelief at the extent of what Claire had been through. "If you knew you were in danger, why come back here?" Claire stared at him, her eyes shining with something that seemed somewhere between fear and determination. "Because I thought they would never find me here. And because there's something here that I need to resolve before moving on." "Something? What would be so important for you to risk your life?" She hesitated, as if weighing each word. "There's something I left behind, Mike. Something that belongs to me that I could never leave in their hands. I need to find it before they do." The mystery surrounding what Claire was looking for intrigued Mike even more. He knew Brookfield had its own secrets, but he never imagined his hometown would be involved in something so dark. However, upon seeing Claire's condition, he knew he couldn't let her face this alone. He was determined to protect her whatever the cost. As the night deepened, they knew time was running out. Whatever Claire was looking for, whatever was so important, it was only a matter of time before those chasing her found it too. The morning came slow and heavy in Brookfield, with the sky still thick with dark clouds and the humid air promising more rain. Mike barely slept the night before, restless about Claire's revelations and what it meant for them. He knew time was of the essence, but he was still trying to process everything he had learned. Claire, exhausted and emotionally worn out, slept for a few hours on the couch in Mike's living room. When she woke up, she seemed a little more centered, but the fear was still present in her eyes. She knew time was not on her side. Mike noticed the urgency in her eyes and decided it was time to act. "We need to find out exactly what they're looking for, Claire. If you want to find it before they do, we need to know where to look," Mike said, trying to convey confidence. Claire nodded, taking a deep breath before starting. "There's a place I never wanted to go back to. The house I grew up in. After my parents died, the house was abandoned, and I thought I'd never need to go back there. But now I have no choice." The Donovan home was on the outskirts of Brookfield, an old Victorian mansion that had long since become an urban legend among locals. Abandoned, with broken windows and walls covered in ivy, it was the kind of place children avoided passing by at night. Mike remembered when they were young and how Claire hated that house, always full of shadows and dark memories. They decided to go there as quickly as possible. Mike's patrol car cut through the city streets in silence, while Claire stood tensely beside him, as if at any moment something could go wrong. When they arrived at the Donovan mansion, the place seemed even more oppressive than Mike remembered. The wrought iron fence was rusted and crooked, and the garden had turned into a jungle of wild vegetation. "Are you sure it's here?" Mike asked, looking at the house with a growing sense of unease. "Yes, Claire replied firmly. "What they want is here, hidden." They walked along the stone path to the entrance, the sound of their boots crunching dry leaves breaking the silence. Claire hesitated for a moment before opening the front door, which creaked in protest. The interior was dark and smelled musty, the air heavy with the humidity that had accumulated over the years. "Let's get straight to the point," Claire said, heading down to the house's basement. Mike followed, feeling the wooden floor creaking beneath his feet. The basement was a place he had never visited, not even when they were children. He had always heard rumors about what the Donovans were hiding there, but he had never paid much attention. Claire turned on the flashlight Mike had brought, and they descended the steep stairs, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The basement was full of old boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. Claire walked to the back, where a brick wall looked newer than the rest of the structure. "It's here," she said, her voice full of emotion. Mike watched as Claire began to remove the bricks with shaking hands, slowly revealing a hidden space in the wall. Inside was a small wooden box, ancient and delicately carved with rusty locks. "What is this, Claire?" Mike asked, intrigued. Claire carefully opened the box, revealing a bundle of old letters and a small leather-bound notebook. "It's evidence, Mike. Evidence that can destroy very powerful people. My father kept it here, thinking it would be safe, but I knew one day they would come back for it." Mike picked up one of the letters and read it quickly. They contained incriminating information about a network of corruption that involved influential politicians and business people who seemed untouchable. Now, everything made sense. Claire had fled to protect this evidence, knowing her life was at risk. But before they could discuss what to do, the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside made them freeze. Mike looked at Claire, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. They were no longer alone. Mike quickly turned off the flashlight and they hid behind a pile of boxes. The sound of footsteps echoing in the house above them was unmistakable. Someone had followed Claire there, and it wasn't for talking. "Mike, they came to get me," Claire whispered, panic rising in her voice. "We're not going to let that happen," Mike replied, trying to remain calm. He drew his gun and positioned himself to protect Claire at any cost. The footsteps approached, descending the stairs, and the tension in the air was palpable. When the intruders finally appeared, Mike recognized one of the men as one of the henchmen Claire had spoken about. They were armed and ready to use force. The moment the first man entered the basement, Mike acted quickly. A shot rang out in the small room, hitting the henchman in the leg. The man screamed in pain and fell to the ground, but before Mike could act against the second man, he was hit from behind. The pain was intense and immediate, and Mike's world began to go dark. Claire, seeing Mike being attacked, fought panic. She knew she couldn't let them take the evidence. With desperate courage, she picked up the box and ran for the stairs, but the second man caught up with her before she could leave. "You're not going anywhere, bitch," he muttered, gripping her arm tightly. It was then that Claire did something unexpected. In one quick movement, she picked up Mike's gun lying on the floor and fired. The man let out a scream and staggered back, giving Claire the chance to run. She ran out of the house, her heart beating in her chest like a drum, not knowing where to go or what to do next. But she knew she couldn't give up. Not now. Back in the basement, Mike, still dazed from the pain, saw the other man crawling towards the exit. He knew he didn't have much time before the situation got even worse. With effort, he managed to get up, picked up the radio, and called for backup. His voice cracked with pain. Claire managed to hide in the woods behind the house, her body shaking with fear and adrenaline. She knew the city would no longer be safe for her. With the evidence in hand, and Mike seriously injured, the game had changed for good. Now they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting an enemy who would do anything to protect them. The forest surrounding the Donovan mansion was plunged into an almost unearthly silence, interrupted only by the sound of Claire's labored breathing as she ran through the trees. Every step was a fight against fatigue, but she knew that stopping was not an option. The evidence in her hands was her only chance to unmask the powerful men who had pursued her for so many years, but it also made her an even bigger target. Meanwhile, Mike fought the pain and darkness that threatened to engulf him completely. The blow to the head had left him dizzy and disoriented, but his determination to protect Claire and expose the truth kept him on his feet. He had managed to call for reinforcements, but he knew they wouldn't arrive in time to stop the henchmen from returning. I needed to act quickly. With effort, Mike reached the pistol lying on the floor and staggered towards the basement exit. Every movement was torture, but he forced himself to continue. As he emerged into the dim morning light, he saw one of the injured henchmen trying to get up. With a firm voice despite the pain, Mike pointed the gun at him. "Don't move, you're trapped," Mike said, breathing heavily. The henchman, visibly panicked, raised his hands. "You don't know who you're messing with, officer. This is much bigger than you realize. It's bigger than you think too, because I won't stop until I take you all down." Mike shot back, not looking away. He used the last of his strength to handcuff the man and left him tied to the mansion's rusty gate. Now he needed to find Claire before the other henchmen caught up with her. Mike followed the trail that led into the forest, his vision blurred and his ears ringing. He could barely keep his balance, but the thought of Claire alone, facing these men, kept him going. As he advanced, he began to see bloodstains on the floor, small drops that indicated Claire had been injured in her escape. Meanwhile, Claire continued to run, her mind a storm of chaotic thoughts. She knew that once she turned the evidence over to the police, her life would never be the same. She would have to leave everything behind, start over somewhere else, maybe even under a new name. But first I needed to get out of there alive. She finally found a hiding place, a small hole between the roots of an old gnarled tree. There, he curled up, trying to control his breathing as he held the evidence box tightly. The sound of the henchman's footsteps echoed in the distance, and she knew she wasn't safe. But at that moment, she felt paralyzed by fear. In the silence, Claire began to think about everything she had lost over the years. Her family, her friends, her own identity. The anger she had kept bottled up for so long began to bubble up inside her. She didn't want to run away anymore. I didn't want to hide anymore. She wanted to face those who had made her suffer. However, things took an unexpected turn when the footsteps stopped and Mike's familiar voice echoed through the forest. "Claire, where are you? Claire, it's me, Mike." The relief was immediate, but was soon followed by a wave of guilt. She had dragged Mike into this nightmare. She knew he could die for trying to protect her. Determined not to let anyone else get hurt because of her, Claire came out of hiding. "Mike," she called, her voice still shaking. "I am here." Mike staggered towards her, relieved to see her safe, but his condition left no doubt that he was injured and exhausted. "Claire, we need to get out of here now." Before they could move, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the forest. Claire felt the impact before she even heard the shot. An intense heat took over her shoulder, and she fell to her knees, letting out a cry of pain. Mike, panicked, ran towards her, using his own body as a shield. "No, no, no," Mike muttered, trying desperately to stop the blood gushing from Claire's wound. He knew he was at a disadvantage. The remaining henchman approached, a victorious expression on his face, his gun pointed at them. Mike didn't have many options. He knew he needed to do something quickly to save Claire's life and his own. Using the last of his strength, he stood up, and with a scream of fury, shot at the henchman. The shot was accurate, hitting the man in the chest. He fell onto his back with a look of shock on his face before he died. The sound of the gunshot seemed to echo endlessly through the forest as Mike fell next to Claire, exhausted and in pain. "Claire, stay with me. You're going to be okay," he said, his voice cracking with pain and despair. Claire, despite the intense pain, held Mike's hand, trying to smile. "We did it, Mike, it's over." But Mike knew it wasn't over. The evidence Claire carried was powerful enough to bring down very influential people, and that meant more dangers would come. He needed to get her out of there, and quickly. A few minutes later, the sound of sirens in the distance indicated that reinforcements had finally arrived. Mike sighed in relief, but still didn't allow himself to relax. He kept Claire awake, talking to her, trying to distract her from the pain until help arrived. Paramedics arrived and quickly stabilized Claire, placing her on a stretcher and preparing her for transport to the hospital. Mike insisted on going with her, even though he was injured. He wouldn't leave her alone, not after everything they had been through. As the ambulance headed to the hospital, Mike looked at Claire, who was pale but conscious. "I promise I'll protect you, Claire, and I'll make sure these bastards pay for what they did," Claire squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "And I promise I'll never run away again. I'll fight, Mike. Let's fight together." At the hospital, as Claire was wheeled into surgery, Mike sat in the waiting room, finally allowing the pain and exhaustion to take over his body. But his mind was alert, planning his next steps. He knew that, with the evidence in hand, he had a real chance of taking down the criminal network that had destroyed Claire's life. And he would do it, even if it was the last thing he did. Brookfield Hospital was silent that morning, except for the sound of nurses' hurried footsteps and the constant beeping of machines monitoring patients. The rain continued to beat against the windows, reflecting the tension that hung in the air. Mike sat in the waiting room, his exhausted body propped up in one of the uncomfortable chairs as he awaited news about Claire. The throbbing pain in his head and the injuries he had suffered were hard to ignore, but worry about Claire kept him awake. He knew she was in good hands, but he also knew the danger had not yet passed. The evidence Claire had found in the basement of the Donovan mansion had the potential to destroy powerful careers, and those involved would do anything to stop that from happening. As he waited, the sound of firm footsteps echoed through the hallway. Mike looked up and saw Captain Reynolds, his superior and a trusted man, approaching. The captain was a middle-aged man, with a tough but fair expression. When he saw Mike, he frowned, worried. "Turner, what the hell happened here?" Reynolds asked, his voice low but full of authority. Mike sighed, running a hand over his still sore head. "Captain, it's a long story, but in short, Claire Donovan found incriminating evidence against very influential people. They tried to kill her, and now she's undergoing surgery. We need to act quickly to ensure this evidence is used correctly." Reynolds nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "These people, do you think they have enough influence to cause us trouble?" "More than you can imagine," Mike replied, his voice deep. "But we can't let them win. Claire risked everything to bring this evidence to light. If we do nothing, it will be like all her sacrifice was in vain." Reynolds pondered for a moment before placing a hand on Mike's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and support. "You did the right thing, Turner. I'll make sure this evidence is secured and used to take down whoever is behind this. But you need to rest. You won't be able to do much good if you fall to the ground hard." Before Mike could respond, a doctor came out of the operating room with a serious expression. "Are you the officer who brought Mrs. Donovan?" he asked, looking at Mike. "Yes, it's me. How is she?" Mike stood up quickly, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to knock him over. "The injury was serious, but we managed to stabilize her. She lost a lot of blood and will need a considerable amount of time to recover, but the chances are good," said the doctor, trying to reassure him. Mike let out a sigh of relief, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Can I see her? She is being taken to the ICU. You can see her after the situation is under control, but she will need rest," the doctor explained before walking away. Mike felt his legs shaking and sat down again, finally allowing the adrenaline to begin to subside. I knew there was still a lot of work to do, but at that moment, the news that Claire was alive and had a chance to recover was all that mattered. Reynolds, observing Mike, decided to take matters into his own hands. "I will arrange an escort to protect you here at the hospital and ensure that the evidence is delivered directly to the FBI. We will not let this be hushed up, Turner." Mike just nodded, grateful that he wasn't alone in this battle. But even with all the security measures being taken, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still about to happen. The network of corruption that Claire had exposed would not give up so easily, and he knew that the real confrontation was yet to come. Hours later, early in the morning, Mike was allowed to visit Claire in the ICU. The sight of her, pale and frail in the hospital bed, made his heart sink. She was hooked up to several devices, and the constant sound of the heart monitor filled the room. He approached slowly, pulling out a chair to sit next to her. "Claire," he whispered, gently taking her hand. She was cold to the touch, but he held on tight as if he wanted to convey all the strength he had left. Claire opened her eyes slowly, her gaze still clouded by the pain and medication. "Mike." Her voice was a faint whisper, but the relief at seeing him was evident. "You're safe now, Claire. We're going to make these bastards pay for what they did. You'll get out of this, I promise," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Claire tried to smile, although the gesture was a little painful. I couldn't have done this without you. Thank you, Mike, for never giving up on me." Mike felt tears pool in his eyes, but he held them back. "I would never give up on you, Claire. Not now, not after everything we've been through." But as Mike spoke, Claire's heart monitor began beeping irregularly. The sound was enough to make his heart stop for a second. He stood up quickly, looking desperately at the monitor. Claire, stay with me," he shouted, squeezing her hand tighter. Doctors and nurses burst into the room, pulling Mike away and trying to revive Claire. He watched helplessly as they struggled to stabilize her, the panic and pain increasing with each passing second. The tension in the room was palpable, and Mike felt the world crumbling around him. But then the monitor stabilized, and the steady sound of the heartbeat filled the room again. The doctors breathed a sigh of relief, and one of them turned to Mike. "She is fighting, but will need intensive care. Please go and rest, sir," the doctor said gently. Mike, still in shock, nodded slowly, feeling completely exhausted. He knew he couldn't do anything else here, but leaving Claire's side seemed like the hardest thing in the world. Finally, he allowed himself to be led out of the ICU, his mind still shrouded in a fog of worry and fear. But as he walked down the hallway, something inside him changed. Claire had fought against everything and everyone to get here, and now, he knew he needed to fight too, not just to protect her, but to ensure the truth was revealed, and those who persecuted her were brought to justice. The real showdown was lurking, and Mike was ready to face it, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. The days that followed were marked by a feeling of uncertainty and growing tension. Brookfield Hospital was surrounded by police, ensuring that no intruder could get close to Claire, who remained in the ICU, still in critical condition. Mike, although physically and emotionally exhausted, refused to leave his side. He knew the battle was far from over. The evidence found by Claire at the Donovan mansion was quickly turned over to the FBI. The contents of the letters and notebook were explosive, revealing a complex network of corruption that included high-ranking politicians, influential business people, and even members of the security forces. The documents detailed bribes, influence peddling, and even assassination orders. It was clear that many lives would be destroyed by these revelations. The town of Brookfield, which had always been quiet and peaceful, suddenly found itself at the center of a national scandal. The news spread quickly, and soon reporters from across the country were camped in the streets, trying to capture any details about the case. The pressure on local and federal authorities was increasing every day, and Mike knew that the noose was closing in on the culprits. But with that, the feeling of danger also grew. Mike was aware that those being exposed would not surrender easily. He and Claire were still targets, and that meant he couldn't let his guard down. Captain Reynolds provided extra protection for Mike, aware that his life was also at risk, but this did not ease the tension. Meanwhile, Claire continued to fight for her life. Physical wounds were only part of the problem. The years of trauma and fear had left her deeply scarred. Even as her body slowly recovered, it was clear the emotional battle would be long and arduous. But each time Mike visited Claire, he found her a little stronger, with a quiet determination in her eyes. Finally, a week after the evidence was turned over, the FBI launched a coordinated operation in several cities around the country. Arrests were made, and the names of those involved began to appear in newspaper headlines and on television news. The network of corruption was being dismantled, and the people who had ruined Claire's life were finally facing justice. But there was still one last piece of this puzzle, something that wasn't completely solved. Mike knew that the leaders of this organization were still at large, and that they would do anything to escape justice. And he was right. The following night, while the city was plunged into darkness, an attempted break-in was made at the hospital. 3 men, armed and determined, tried to enter the ICU where Claire was admitted. However, the police were prepared. The confrontation was brief but intense, and the intruders were quickly neutralized. When Mike heard about the incident, he felt anger rising within him. They had come very close, and it was a reminder that the battle was not over yet. He knew he needed to act before more lives were put in danger. The next morning, Mike approached Captain Reynolds with a proposal. "We need to put an end to this once and for all, Captain. We know who the leaders of this organization are, but they are hidden. I want to lead the team that goes after them." Reynolds looked at Mike with a serious expression. knowing how much that meant to him. "Turner, you're right. This needs to end, and we need someone we can trust to lead this operation. But are you sure you're ready? You're still hurt." "It doesn't matter. I can't rest while these men are still free. They won't stop until they're dead or in prison. And I won't stop until they pay for what they did to Claire and so many other people," Mike replied firmly. Reynolds nodded, seeing the determination in Mike's eyes. "Then let's get this over with." The operation was meticulously planned, and that same night, Mike led a team of federal agents on a raid on a safe house on the outskirts of town where the organization's leaders were hiding. The confrontation was intense, with shots exchanged in a desperate battle. But in the end, the leaders of the criminal organization were captured. When Mike returned to the hospital, covered in dust and still with adrenaline coursing through his veins, he went straight to Claire's room. She was awake, her eyes still tired but with a spark of hope. He walked over and, without saying a word, took her hand. "It's done, Claire. They've been arrested. It's over," he said, feeling the weight of the last few days finally starting to lift. Claire looked at him, tears filling her eyes. "Thanks, Mike. I never would have done it without you." "You were the bravest of us all," he replied, shaking her hand gently. "Now you can rest. You can start thinking about your future." Claire smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't seen in a long time. "I think I can finally start living again." The days that followed were of recovery and reconstruction. Claire, although still fragile, began to make plans for the future, considering the possibility of moving to a new city and starting her life over. Mike, in turn, felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew that although the physical and emotional scars were still present, both he and Claire had overcome something immense. The sun was beginning to shine again over Brookfield, dispelling the shadows that had accumulated over the past few weeks. The truth had been revealed, and justice was being served. And with that, Mike and Claire could finally look to the future with hope. 6 months have passed since the day the corruption network was dismantled, and those responsible were brought to justice. Brookfield, which had been a quiet, small town for so long, was beginning to return to normal, although the scars of the scandal were still visible. The headlines were gone and the town was slowly returning to what it once was. But for Mike and Claire, nothing would be the same. Claire, now in full recovery, had left Brookfield. She decided that the best thing for her would be to start over in a new place, where she could finally free herself from the shadows of the past and build a life that was truly hers. She moved to Portland, Oregon, where she began working with a nonprofit that helped victims of trafficking and violence get back on their feet. He used his own story as a source of inspiration and strength to help others find their path. Claire had finally found her. Mike remained in Brookfield, but something inside him had changed profoundly. The experience of facing corruption and protecting Claire turned him into a man even more determined to fight for justice, but it also made him realize how important it was to value the little things in life. He began spending more time with his family, reconnecting with people he had neglected during his years of intense service. They still kept in touch. Mike and Claire spoke often, and in their conversations, their friendship and mutual respect continued to grow. There was a sense of peace in knowing that even though they had taken different paths, they were both in better, safer, happier places. One sunny afternoon, Mike received a letter from Claire. Inside was a photo of her in her new apartment, smiling alongside a group of women she had helped. On the back of the photo, she wrote a short but meaningful message. "Thank you for helping me find my way back. Now it's my turn to help others. You'll always have a friend here. Love, Claire." Mike smiled as he read the letter, feeling proud not only of Claire but also of the path they had both traveled. He kept the photo and letter in his drawer, alongside other precious memories, as a symbol that even on the darkest nights, there is always a light waiting to be found. And so, life continued for both, marked by overcoming courage and renewal. They knew that the future would still bring challenges, but now they were ready to face them, each in their own way, with the strength they had discovered within themselves.